Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Danish English Language TV channel, the global voice of the Center for Muslim World Studies. And today it is a profound honor of mine and delight to have a dear friend and an impeccable scholar, Dr. Sher Tareen. One of his most recent books won the American Institute of Pakistan Studies Book Prize, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, an absolutely phenomenal book. And I can say that with authority because I've read it and reviewed it. So it really, I can't overstate this enough that Dr. Sher Tareen is one of the few, I would say, from our generation of kind of Pakistani Americans that has really interrogated much of the kind of conceptual, analytical frameworks that we have very loosely and sometimes very lazily deployed in kind of understanding the social, political, the theological conditions that have existed within South, particularly in South Asia and in Pakistan. And one of his pieces that, in fact, we had translated, or at least combined of two of his pieces, was a very interesting piece, Imranophobia, not Islamophobia, Imranophobia and liberal fundamentalists. A very interesting and provocative title. But what I wanted to do in this show, and inshallah we will have at least a two-part series on this, because again, it's an absolute privilege to have him with us, and whatever time he can take, we would love to have him back to further elaborate on these very central, pivotal issues that I think that a good section of Pakistani intelligentsia need to engage more with in terms of deepening our understanding and analysis of religious and theological polemics that exist in the country, of social political developments, of a whole variety of tendencies and trends that have emerged, particularly in Pakistan, although of course his studies in South Asia as well, but for our purposes dealing with Pakistan. So what I wanted to do in this show, Sher Ali, is that maybe go over some basic kind of definitional issues, and I don't, both of us coming kind of from sort of religious studies and some philosophical studies and so on. So definitions are important, but of course definitions by themselves are not like going, and this is one thing that I think it's very important to emphasize. It's not like going to a dictionary, Webster's dictionary, and okay, here's the definition of secularism or of liberalism or so on. It's also the way that we need to understand these terms is not etymologically like, okay, what is the root of the term, and therefore there's a definition, but in terms of how it's used in its context. I think that's the important point, and I think that I hope we have some agreement on that, the way they're used in certain contexts. And so what I really wanted to start with is by in some ways informing the viewers that Dr. Sher Tareen has studied kind of the way colonial modernity has unfolded in the South Asian context, and particularly what we're looking at today, the Pakistani context, and how the narratives and the larger discourse around concepts of secularism, liberalism, and particularly as they have evolved to the present moment, when someone like a character like Imran Khan has come to power, and how we still see the resuscitation, revitalization of these concepts constantly being deployed in ways that may not be so helpful in really understanding what's going on. So I know that's kind of going a little bit all over the place, Sher Ali, but in some ways, can we just begin with some of your own reflections of kind of your own reflections on why was there kind of an impulse within you to kind of investigate and interrogate these concepts in the South Asian and Pakistani context, and what compelled you to perhaps problematize the way that these terms have been deployed in our context?
Thank you so much, Dinesh, for having me on Daanish TV, which is a tremendous forum. It really is a privilege and honor to be here and to be in conversation with you. One way to address the question that you're asking and the kind of framing that you've presented here is to think a bit about how particular categories of life and particular words and ideas, how they come to take particular meanings and particular attitudes and ways of approaching them, and how they become so encrusted in our imaginaries that it becomes impossible to rethink them or to think about them in different ways. So one key category of life, which really I think is central to how we think about ideas of religion, how we think about Islam in the context of South Asia or elsewhere, of course, is this idea of secularism. And oftentimes this kind of a common assumption that we find, which has been increasingly critiqued, of course, in the academic study of religion, anthropology, political studies, etc., in the last couple of decades, especially, this idea that religion represents the opposite of secularism, that there is this idea of religion which primarily is invested in terms of belief in God, in rituals, in sort of bodily practices, etc., submission to external forms of authority, whether that is divine authority or human authorities, like religious scholars, etc. And then the secular is the opposite of that, which has to do with things to do with politics and reason and law, and for human beings to decide on their own how they want to chart and how they want to sort of choreograph their daily moral political lives. So this kind of binary between the religious and the secular is something which has increasingly come under question. So in my own sort of writing and thinking and scholarship, Junaid, I primarily am trained in religious studies, in Islamic studies. What I primarily do is look at the texts and the thought and the religious careers of important scholars, primarily the South Asian context, but I try to connect them to other contexts, especially in the pre-modern period as well, and to make sense of them. So the first book that we'll hopefully get to talk to in the part 2 of our interview, Defending Mohammedan Minority, was about this ongoing polemic in South Asia to do with these two very prominent groups of Muslim scholars called the Deobandis and the Barelvis. And, this kind of a Deobandi-Barelvi polemic is oftentimes looked at from this very predictable sort of a liberal secular binary that, one group is sort of the banner bearers of Sharia and Islamic law or harsh legalism. That is, of course, the Deobandis. And then on the other hand, there is this kind of soft Sufis, mystics, etc., who love the Prophet and all that, and they, of course, are the Barelvis.
Or in more simplistic Mamdanian terms, the good Muslims and the bad Muslims.
Exactly, and this kind of a framing, right? So basically, even if you look at that one example, one very important example, but one specific example of how a certain kind of a liberal secular expectation of how Muslim scholars and actors ought to be represented is already shaping our attitude in terms of how we're looking at this intra-Muslim contest, which has a very different kind of logic. And what I try to show in this book is that, both of these scholars are prominent legal scholars and Sufi masters. And we cannot look at it from this kind of a binary perspective, but their internal logics are something very different. And the framing I provided was that they are representations of what I call competing political theologies. Very briefly, that my main argument was that when Muslims lose their political sovereignty in the late 18th and the 19th century South Asia, Muslim scholars become much more invested in the question of divine sovereignty and its relationship to prophetic authority and the practice of everyday life. And this Barelvi Deobandi polemic is the representation of this particular moment. So anyway, so this is one example of how this whole idea that there are certain kinds of secular templates according to which we then look at different non-Western traditions or global South contestations, etc., and how that kind of colors our way of approaching these intra-Muslim debates and conversations and so on. So the larger sort of thrust here is to be a bit more suspicious of the kind of story that secularism tells about itself as having eclipsed religion as having eclipsed tradition, as having eclipsed superstition, and having entered the era of reason and enlightenment, etc., which has a very specific history. It has a very specific post-17th century, post-Westphalia Western history, through which then the rest of the world is then approached and examined and stationed on the interrogation table of secular power. So to answer your question, what interests me is to rethink this kind of assumed normativity, assumed normalcy of looking at secular power as the arbiter of how we look at religious traditions and religion in different contexts, including in Muslim majority contexts. So that kind of work, of course, the fancy term that academics often give is genealogy, to think about the genealogy of particular categories so that we can think about them in slightly different ways than these commonplace, entrenched ways that have become so commonplace that oftentimes we don't even rethink them. So that's the kind of political work that I think is absolutely crucial in rethinking the entrenched, encrusted meanings that these kinds of important categories of life, like secularism, have come to take.
Very, very well put, Sher. And I think just within that one answer, the incredible amount of insights that we have gained. And I really appreciated the point towards the end, the notion that, of course, many scholars have written about, and of course we pay homage to someone like Talal Asad on this point, that the whole notion of kind of this that religion of basically post-enlightenment, a religion of northwestern Christianity, that specific socio-historical context of the way that religion and secularism then emerges then is supposed to be the way that it unfolds in every single context, tradition, culture, faith tradition, all around the world, which is, on the face of it, just in very simple, should seem absurd that should happen. But we take it at face value that this is the way that things should unfold. But that's I think an incredibly important point that sometimes our intelligentsia here miss, that these things have very specific histories. There's a specific social historical experience with these processes of secularization, of secularism, and so on that have occurred that are very specific to these areas. And I think that's an important point. Just one thing, Shirley, I did want you to in some ways define is the term political theology, because I also, very much use this, but I think that it's an important concept, but I think many people are not too familiar with it. So it'd be great if you could kind of speak a little bit about it, political theology.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, oftentimes one can, this of course is a very fluid category that has been discussed in very different ways by different kinds of scholars in different fields. And I think the kind of field that you're situated in oftentimes does inform the way you approach this category. In a nutshell, it's about the sort of interactions between theology and politics, and to look at these two categories as always inseparably enmeshed, as really being co-constitutive, and always as two categories that always cross-pollinate each other. The way in which this category really becomes popularized oftentimes, of course, is this very famous text by this German theorist / lawyer Carl Schmitt called Political Theology, in which his main argument was that the modern state that we see as having eclipsed an older theological monarchical form of political order, the modern state really is a secularized version of a sort of a pre-modern divine order, in which the modern state really acts like a divine sovereign, but in a secularized way. So in a nutshell, what Carl Schmitt was interested in was to look at the theological underpinnings of modern secular politics. So that although modern secular politics announces itself as having eclipsed and completely foreshadowed sort of an earlier vision of a divine or sort of a theologically grounded political order, that in fact the modern state is a secularized form of theology in a nutshell. What I try to do in my book, for example, is to sort of invert that kind of a problem space by looking at not so much the theological underpinnings of the modern state or of secular politics, but to look at ways in which these intra-Muslim theological controversies and debates and discourses oftentimes can be connected to larger political aspirations. So what I was interested in was that with the fall of the Mughal Empire and the ascendance of British colonialism in South Asia, when these Muslim scholars in the early 19th century and then later in the 19th century, when they take on the form of these group-centered orientations like Barelvi's, deobandis, they of course have precedents of individual scholars who were not divided into groups but were debating these issues. Then they debate issues like prophetic intercession or which is shafa'ah of the prophet on the day of judgment, or heretical innovation or bid'at, etc. These theological legal issues. What kinds of political projects are these connected to? What kinds of political imaginaries of how they imagine divine sovereignty, how they imagine the prophet and his relationship to the everyday life of the community? Is it organized in the form of a hierarchy in which you have the divine sovereign, the prophet, and then the everyday sort of practices of the masses? Or is there some kind of a radical horizontal relationship between the masses, the individual, and the divine sovereign? So how are these theological debates and discourses connected to the larger political transformations that are going on in South Asia from the late 18th to the 19th century onwards? So I was interested in the political aspirations invested in seemingly, ostensibly, theological debates and disputes. So that's how I intervene in the field of political theology, by really bringing Muslim religious scholars, the ulama, into the conversation as a way to really decolonize the study of political theology. That it's not only about the study of Western political structures and how they're informed by Western theological foundations, but to look at how, from a global South context, how that can inform and further enrich our understanding of political theology.
And I'm really glad, Sher Ali, that you used the term decolonize, because in some ways the process of interrogating the conventional orthodox ways in which we have been socialized through, in some ways, a Eurocentric Western episteme to understand these terms, it is really a project now of kind of decolonizing our understandings of many of these terms.
Absolutely. And I would say that, having a more critical perspective on these categories like secularism is precisely a decolonial practice. And one of the reasons why this can be a bit challenging in different contexts, I think even in the case of Pakistan, the kind of larger sort of, less so Pakistan studies, but I think the larger sort of ambit of, as you might call it, Pakistan sort of intellectual formations, etc., popular discourses. The idea that to look at a category critically does not mean to be against it or to reject it, right? So that's one of the major misconceptions, that this whole critical secularism studies that has been inaugurated and written about in such complicated, interesting ways by scholars like Talal Asad, Professor Sabah Mahmood, Hussain Agrama, of course, Professor Salman Sayyid, whose chapter on secularism in his Recalling the Caliphate is absolutely terrific. It's, I think, one of the most profound 14 pages you will read. I would highly recommend that one chapter.
My supervisor, by the way.
Terrific, absolutely. I can see the genealogy of that thought, right? This idea that if you do not think about secularism, this idea that if you think about secularism critically, or that you uninherit these kinds of conventional ways of looking at secularism, that it's some kind of an antidote to quote-unquote religious fundamentalism, the assumption oftentimes is that if you look at it critically, then religion will spiral out of control. That secularism is a necessary medicine, a necessary antidote to this, burgeoning of quote-unquote religious fundamentalism, fanaticism, etc. The problem in this kind of a view is that it is participating in a particular conception of religion as always susceptible, as always vulnerable to erupting into the public sphere in particularly dangerous and violent ways. So it has a particular assumption about religion, which is a dominantly secular assumption about religion that is then authorizing the status of secularism as the antidote to that thing which it is defining, religion as violent, fanatic, etc. So this is the kind of commonplace way of looking at secularism that I see very dominant, of course, in multiple contexts. And the interesting thing is how much it has become pervasive, even in global South contexts like South Asia, etc.
And despite the fact, this is the irony of it, despite the fact that beyond speaking about this in kind of a theoretical and intellectual, we have ample empirical evidence that demonstrates that the vast majority of violence has nothing to do with religion. It's been states and secular ideologies and so on and so forth that have killed millions.
Absolutely.
Yet we still persist in saying the horror. In Talal
Yeah.
Assad's book, and several of his, but it's on suicide bombing. The horror
Yeah.
of kind of the religious violence is just something on another level, despite its
Right.
incomparable kind of the numbers to kind of secular state violence.
Yeah, I think there are 2 points we made there. One, the one that you just made, that this idea that some kind of an embrace of this thing called secularism is an antidote or a guarantor of civic peace, simply
Right.
empirically does not hold out, right? Empirically,
Right.
there are
Right.
many Muslims around the world would not have much confidence in this because there have been self-avowedly secular states who have committed tremendous degrees of violence, perhaps much
Right.
more than avowedly religious actors. But the more important and interesting point here is
Right.
that ultimately one ought to approach secularism as a form of power that
Yeah.
constantly regulates and manages what religion should look like in the modern world. Right? That's basically the nutshell, the kind of the important point that these scholars have made. That the secular is not some kind of an opposite of religion, such that when religion goes up, the secular goes down, some kind of a score sheet. That's some kind of an empirical kind of a chart here, or a kind of a scale here. But rather, secularism is a form of power that manages and regulates and presents a particular kind of normative religion that is at peace
Right.
with liberal political rule, that is at peace with the sovereignty of the modern state. So in this particular sort of example, the idea that religion is only palatable when it has been properly moderated, right? So that's why this category of moderate Islam is so horrendous and problematic, in that primarily it represents a form of Islam, a form of Muslim identity and subjectivity that has been properly controlled, managed, tamed, moderated by the moderating power of liberal political rule and secular power. So to get away with this kind of a notion that secularism is this kind of very eschatological notion, actually interesting, a very theological notion, that secularism is some kind of a panacea, some kind of a messiah that can address the fanaticism of this other category called religion and religious actors. We need to think about secularism in slightly different ways than just as the opposite of religion. This point, of course, is very conventional now. It's very commonplace among scholars of religion, anthropology, etc. The challenge, I think, Junaid, is to make it more translatable, make it more palatable, make it more understandable to a much larger audience, because it is a counterintuitive point. Because this idea that secularism is a virtue that is a good thing that can then moderate religious fanaticism has become so commonplace, so pervasive, even among otherwise relatively intelligent people, that one has to puncture this kind of a reading, and I think that requires making this argument, more. Just talking about it in perhaps more clear ways is important in multiple languages. What can be done there?
Absolutely, and at a more popular level. And in fact, I want to give. I mean, there are very, in fact, few scholars that do that. You are certainly one of them. That I think I wrote once to a friend that Sher Ali for me is someone who can traverse the most profound and sophisticated scholarship, and also traverse the area of that to also making that the main concepts within that work and his corpus of scholarship accessible in various articles that you have written that have had a profound impact, actually, that people can understand whether they agree or disagree, but at least they're accessible to a wide population. And very few scholars do that, and I really want to commend you in being able to do that. So, as a final thing, I want to leave a teaser for our audience so that they come back to part two. But and I hate to put you on the spot, but moving to a very different, or not different, but to very contemporary moment in Pakistan. Contemporary in the sense not just with the emergence of, say, Imran Khan, but throughout the whole period of the so-called war on terror in Pakistan, in which, of course, Imran Khan loomed large as well. because of course he was known, and as you've written in your articles, and I've written about this as well, as good old Taliban Khan, and by a significant section of the liberal intelligentsia in this country, and what of course happens when he's well, even before he's elected to power, and then after he's elected to power. I mean, it's one of the things that really confuses many of us, and I think that maybe your article addresses that, and whatever other reflections you have on it, is that this country has had, of course, many many rulers and politicians that have been rather unimpressive, to put it mildly, yet not subject to the constant barrage of almost this level of hatred and venom on kind of every little thing that that he does. And of course, that doesn't mean that you or myself don't have criticisms of policies and this type of thing, but there's this level of vituperative venom against him that somehow is very difficult to explain just on the grounds of kind of political disagreement. I mean, do we have to go into kind of psychoanalysis for this, or whatever? But anyways, I do want to end with this, because I know you have some thoughts, some very serious thoughts and reflections that you've laid out in some of your articles on this topic of Imranophobia and liberal fundamentalism. So maybe just some reflections on this, and of course in part 2 we can carry it on further.
Sure. No, so thank you for that, Junaid. I just want to specify, I think the article you're mentioning is a 2017 essay, sort of an op-ed piece, really, from 3 years ago. And, in those op-ed pieces, I try to reflect a bit on this kind of, some of these sort of political currents, etc. But they operate on a slightly different register than my scholarship. There is some tangential relationship here and there, but it does operate on a different register. So I just want to clarify that. As you said, I think Imran is an interesting character in that, on the one hand, he of course is a thoroughly modern figure, and in many ways a modernist figure also. This whole way in which he's sort of resituating the idea of the community of Medina as a kind of model that is fully compatible with the values of modernity, but there is a certain kind of way in which he is tracing a sort of a genealogy of justice and a genealogy of catering to the dispossessed that does not pass through Europe, but that has a certain kind of an Islamic beginnings. It's of course a very sort of staple of a Muslim modernist perspective that perhaps is interesting in particular ways. It perhaps does not address a kind of ambiguities in the community of Medina model, in that as much as it did cater to sort of non-Muslim populations and the dispossessed, it did nonetheless have an imperial Muslim political theology underlying its logic, which you had to embrace the logic of Muslim superiority before you entered into an ecumenical space, etc. And as you said, there are other things to be critical about. Increasingly, I think a conception of justice that is perhaps not as enthusiastic about the injustices and the crimes of the military and the deep state that I think he used to be very articulate about maybe a decade ago, etc., in terms of enforced disappearances and basically the violence and crimes of the state that are quite well known. And of course, oftentimes a certain kind of notion of women's development that can have a kind of a patriarchal logic to it. Right. All these different things that one can be very critical about, certainly. Absolutely. But I think what the thing that, now coming to sort of the point that you're raising, I do think it is interesting that the kind of visceral reactions that he oftentimes espouses and generates have perhaps something to do with the fact that he may not fit that well a certain kind of a template of a Western educated secularist that one would desire him to fit into. I think there is this kind of the internal other, the kind of beardless internal other who is not as easily dismissible as the body of the bearded religious elite, right? So basically this whole idea of the way in which this word like mullah is oftentimes bandied around in Pakistani circles, elite circles, etc., with very little knowledge of the ulama traditions and the complexities, the internal their internal sort of debates and the kind of depth of this whole tradition, just taking some actors who fulfill liberal caricatures and making them the kind of representative of this whole tradition is essentially what I call in my book kind of madrasa phobia, right? This idea that you just take a few figures and you really caricature them and look at the most sort of dramatic examples of liberal caricatures, and then you attach that to that whole tradition, right? But perhaps Imran is not as easily dismissible as the body of the bearded religious elite. So there is that thing. But I think there are 2 points that I try to make in that essay, and then a couple of other essays I've written since then on this whole idea of, first of all, I think the whole question of Taliban Khan, what I see his argument, his long-running argument, is that one has to look at the emergence and the efflorescence, or rather the emergence and the metastasis of indigenous violence, militant violence, etc., as intimately connected to U.S. imperial power, and intimately connected to the history of British colonialism and more recently American neo-imperialism, that you cannot separate the two. In some ways there is a pacifist thrust to it that, military solutions cannot be durable, and there has to be some efforts to dialogue, etc. It seems like a very, it's not even a very profound point, it seems a very basic and logical point, but it's interesting the kind of reaction.
And it was, I mean, because I was here during this time, it was very frustrating when normally a progressive community that is anti-war generally, all of a sudden, even before kind of the major attacks, maybe the school attack on Peshawar and that type, even before that, more than willing to kind of endorse military operations that would target God knows who, a collective punishment and all of these things, that at that time they had very little concern of which Pathans would be affected, displaced, and so on. But all of a sudden, today and before the elections, the concern comes out. Whereas throughout that period, basically, there was one person who was actually opposed to military operations, and that was our good friend Taliban Khan.
Right, and I think the larger point is that you cannot be anti-militarization and anti-military and still be pro-war. That does not happen, right? And I think another sort of clarification I should make, maybe I should have made it in that op-ed essay, op-ed you get limited space, that when I use this kind of provocative category of liberal fundamentalist, I did not mean, of course, the entirety of the left or all critics of Imran. Of course, a very sophisticated critique that one can launch on precisely these questions, and many of those critiques I would agree with. But I was referring to a very specific kind of breed, that it kind of pervades the kind of opinion pieces and newspapers, etc. The kind of sort of shallow commentaries in terms of looking at the world in terms of this binary of being divided between religious fanatics and the enlightened sort of secular moderate.
Liberals or fundos, yes.
Exactly.
It goes here.
So that was one point. And the second, I think, issue on which I think he has spoken in rather interestingly sophisticated ways is this whole issue of Islamophobia, and in the context of the Danish cartoons and more recently, France, etc. And I think the speech that he gave at the OIC last year and also the UN speech, I think he made a very interesting sort of argument, which are two parts as I read it. One was, why is the kind of pain which is associated with caricaturing the Prophet, peace be upon him, so untranslatable, so illegible to these Western audiences, which of course is a question that in much more sophisticated ways was explored by Professor Sabah Mahmood in her landmark article called Religious Reason and Secular Affect, an Incommensurable Divide. It's an incredible article. So that question also came up in those two speeches. And then the whole other point that he made was the question of why are these forms of violence associated with Islam or with Muslim militants always reduced to religion, as having religious motivations, whereas violence that is emanating from the Tamil Tigers, etc., other kinds of groups are not reduced to religion. So why is Islam pigeonholed in this way in which the violence emanating from Muslim subjects, from Muslim actors, is reduced to having quote unquote religious motivations, and it is then divorced from the political work that violence does? So that's how struggles in Kashmir and Palestine are delegitimated, that these are religious forms of violence, and hence, they are to be called militancy and terrorism, etc. So how is terror, how is violence defined as being the opposite of politics? And so basically, what I saw was the implication of Imran's argument was to look at the intimacy of violence and politics, and this kind of a liberal, secular, Western assumption that when Muslims commit violence, it has nothing to do with politics. It's not political. It's religious. Whereas when you maim and kill hundreds of children in the name of national security through drone strikes and then write memoirs about that with playlists, you have to celebrate it as some kind of hip African American president, and that's political. That's political, and that's not religious. And that, of course,
the Islamophobia involved in this is so deep in many of these Islamic societies. In fact, even the discussion here where we're talking about the plight of the Palestinians, the focus, and again, this was in a very progressive liberal group, but again, why is Hamas so popular there, and why do they have to be such a a religious kind of a religious extremist group that engages in violence and so on? I say, and of course, the source of it being religion, of all of their political behavior, explaining their political behavior. And then I point out the fact that, look, their actions in terms of the struggle, armed struggle, the semantics and and maybe in religious vocabulary, the fundamental grievances are a military occupation, and whether it's armed resistance or whether it's a truce or a hudna, it's used in Islamic phraseology. So the allergy, and it comes back to Imran as well, when you say there's a deeply allergic response to the notion that he is not speaking and acting in a way that is what I'd like to call NGO speak, that our liberal, secular, elite educated classes have been trained in. Sorry, here's my pet rabbit. That NGO speak, if only he spoke in just purely that type of language, he'd be fine. But this invocation of Medina and of that, well, that he's a believer, that we can't handle.
No, absolutely. And one can be, critical of certain ambiguities. That if he's talking Islamophobia, he's not talking about China. Fair point. But
yes,
he's
of course,
leading a developing country which has, been robbed by these aristocrats for many decades. So that point also there is a real
politics. That's exactly what I was saying. I mean, from Nawaz Sharif to anyone. I mean, really. I mean, and these are, of course, people. Actively complicit with these types of groups, militant, violent groups that were dependent on them. And then, of course, Imran comes to power, and the first questions they start to ask him, what is it? It was quite funny. I mean, people that the country is going more fundamentalist now that Imran has come to power because he's Taliban Khan, and then the blasphemy, etc. As if he had anything to do with the past 40 years of what's been going on in Pakistan.
Right. Yeah. Just to complete my thoughts from your comments here, that there are things that one can, of course, point out as ambiguities and critique these things, etc. But there are some interestingly productive things happening with him also. It's basically my point that I think the problem in terms of commentaries about him is it's either a complete rejection and this kind of vitriolic reactions as someone who's completely drowned by cocaine, and he's just a cricketer and complete a buffoon, essentially, or a dangerous buffoon at best. Or on the other hand, some supporters who just basically turn him into this kind of a pure messiah with no ambiguities, no tension. So as this perhaps does connect to religious studies in that human aptitude is a little more complicated. So I think looking at his complications and ambiguities might be a worthy kind of project. And he's an interesting articulation of a Muslim modernist impulse that I think perhaps also helps us expand the way in which we look at Muslim modernism as not just emerging from Muslim religious scholars, but also from political figures. But I just want to come back to this example of Islamophobia to complete this thought here, and to connect it to the earlier discussion we were having about secularism and how secularism is a form of power that constantly defines religion and its boundaries. Notice how, in this kind of example, in which you limit or reduce violence emanating from Muslim actors to religion, you are actually defining Islam and religion in a particular way as being completely separate and separable from politics. And politics then is being arrogated to the modern state and to a certain kind of a liberal secular virtue. And this is basically the kind of separation between religion and politics that secularism and the form of power that secularism is, that it achieves by framing religion and Islam in a particular way and not realizing that violence and politics is always intimately connected. I mean, the beginnings of the U.S. nation state, the French nation state.
Sher Ali, and this is where the Islamophobia kicks in. There seems to be no problem when Gandhi, someone like a figure like Gandhi, mixes religion and politics, and of course his famous statement is wonderful that says that anyone that thinks that religion and politics can be separated doesn't actually understand either. Or someone like Martin Luther King from the Christian tradition. So we don't have problems with these individuals being deeply faith-based, faith-affirming, and bringing in politics into their praxis. But when it comes to Islam, then it's a whole different matter.
And of course, this particular issue, as you also alluded to, this text on suicide bombing by Professor Talala, is really the most conceptually sophisticated meditation on this question of why, in this kind of a liberal secular framing, is violence thought of as the opposite of politics, and how that then informs these ways of looking at religion, especially questions of Muslim militancy and suicide bombing, etc. So to end this kind of framing, I think there are ambiguities, there are critiques to be made, but I think Imran is also a very interesting figure in many ways, who has an uncanny knack for some conceptual sophistication that one can see if one listens to him carefully, extensively. His sort of reflections on his biography had some very interesting moments on his fundraising for the hospital and the kind of logics of charity that he saw among the people, which makes one think of, more recently the work of anthropologist Amira Mittermeier, Giving for God. We see these kind of logics of piety at work in his sort of campaign for fundraising that we saw. To really put it briefly, there is a gesture at a desire for decolonial politics. Now, there are many ambiguities surrounding that. There are many tensions surrounding that. Maybe it's not executed in a way that would be desirable for most commentators, but there is a gesture nonetheless at a certain kind of a decolonial politics that does not thrive on dehumanizing madrasa actors, that does not thrive on cookie-cutter secular solutions to particular problems, that has a certain semblance of nuance every now and then, and which I think is quite radically different from these other actors who combine in particularly noisome ways intellectual mediocrity with a penchant for exuberant and unceasing corruption. So that's just my view.
I think that the mentioning of the word nuance, that's precisely what is lacking from. Otherwise, you would expect very intelligent commentators and people in media and the intelligentsia. The absence of that nuance and the narrowing, as you said, of these conceptual categories, basically then enables a caricature of the man of Imran Khan, and therefore does not even allow the space for people to be critical supporters of Imran Khan, be critical of him, and also acknowledge kind of his genuine commitment to certain things. The space for that doesn't even exist. They don't allow it to exist because, again, you become part of the Taliban Khan brigade. But I think that there is a relationship, what we're talking about in terms of I don't want to use such strong terms, but the impoverishment of the imagination of conceptualizing these categories and decolonizing them and interrogating them more deeply, and the way that a figure like Imran Khan is perceived of in this country. So, but we can get more into this in the other section. But I would also like to get more into the books because what you describe the trajectory of these polemics, particularly the Deobandi and Barelvi, there is still very much omnipresent today in Pakistan. And so I think that many people will be interested in that. Unfortunately, for today, we've run out of time. And I really am grateful for taking time and also rescheduling. Sher Ali, your scholarship is deeply inspiring. I have to say this, and I hope more and more people actually engage your work because it really is a breath of fresh air for us. In Pakistan, reading the material that you produce and the scholarship. So,
Thank you, Jared, for your time for this platform, and I hope to again be in conversation with you for our part 2 of our conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's really a pleasure.
Thank you, Shirley. Okay. Bye-bye.